We're here with another episode of the Quantum Yoga Podcast. Dr. Joe Tafur is on the program today. It's a pleasure to have you on. Dr. Joe is a medical doctor. He's an author of the book Fellowship of the River, medical consultant for Niue Rao Retreat Center in Iquitos. Is that right? It's in Iquitos, Peru?
Iquitos, Peru. That's right.
Yeah. Co-founder and chairman of Modern Spirit. And welcome to the program.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you for having me on the show.
Let's start with you told a story once on an interview that I listened to about your entry into plant medicine, which is our topic today. And so I would love if you could begin there, because I think it's where a lot of people I notice, including myself, because I've had a little experience with plant medicine, but a lot of people begin this journey into this world that is vast. It is a long tradition, and it is still very much alive in the Amazon and kind of spreading throughout the world.
Yeah. I guess you're talking about my first time getting into peyote. Is that what you're asking about?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Well, I guess my journey into plant medicine and psychedelic plant medicine or spiritual plant medicine began after a period of being depressed in medical school. I had not really been depressed in that kind of way before in my life, so something unique about the circumstances of being in medical school that just made things extra hard on me, and I really had a hard time. And I had tried, looking for help. I kind of recognized myself as being depressed. And my father was a psychiatrist, and he recommended some antidepressants. And I tried it a little bit, and I found that it did help me, as I've told people that I did. Some people claim it doesn't do anything for them, or all that. But for me, it did help me. But I didn't really want to be on it, and I also felt like sorry, there's just something trying to get rid of something here. I felt like a couple things that I mentioned. Number one, that it was at that time I was being exposed to a friend of mine who was entering the world of psychedelic research. It was like I was around 2000, 2001, and a friend of mine was part of that renaissance of psychedelic research, and he was about to get his MD PhD. His PhD research was going to be in psychedelic research in Switzerland with psilocybin and altered states. So I was getting exposed to a lot of research from him that I didn't know anything about, and in particular the relationship between the psychedelics and the antidepressants around the serotonin system and certain kind of activity biochemically of both kind of families of compounds. And I did feel a little bit while I was on antidepressants like I was on something of that style, like the MDMA, which I had only done maybe a couple times, but I did feel kind of tension in my jaw on the antidepressant. And I also felt a little strange kind of vibe in my periphery that reminded me of mushrooms, which again, I had only tried a couple times. I wasn't like an avid psychonautic explorer. I was pretty straight-laced, I'd smoked some marijuana, but wasn't really too active in those areas. But as I found myself taking the antidepressant and saw these kind of symptoms, and then I learned about this resurgence of psychedelic clinical research and then the biochemical connection, it kind of got me over my stigma that I had about that kind of approach. And so then I also was more interested in something natural. And I had the opportunity to go through a peyote ceremony in Arizona, a form of peyote ceremony at the Peyote Way church in Arizona. So I went, and I had an amazing healing. It was one of the most profound experiences of my life. And not profound in the sense of like showing me something spiritual or from the realm of consciousness that I wasn't that I hadn't necessarily approached. I came from a very spiritually oriented family. So it wasn't for that, it was for the healing that it provided me, for the kind of reconnection to myself, to spirituality, to nature, and just how healing that was for me at that time, and how that just kind of totally reset my mental health and gave me this huge opportunity to kind of reboot and ultimately complete medical school and, not really require medication or anything like that, and follow up with different, still trying to get help from different things, and, going to some sweat lodge and asking for the counsel of some people, and a lot of loving, kind friends and community. So I was able to get through, and I went back, a few times over the years. And that led to my exposure to Native American church ceremony, or it's the teepee ceremony, where there is kind of a leader, a roadman. What I had experienced was a spirit walk through the Peyote Way church, which is a solo journey, or it's encouraged to be a solo journey with the medicine in a sacred setting. And that's where I kind of really found my healing. But then I got exposed to traditional healers, people who are working with peyote in kind of a shamanic context. And that really, I got excited about that, to see them, and just it felt very familiar to me, what they were doing. And so that kind of raised my curiosity about what I had been hearing about in the ayahuasca scene coming out of South America. My family being from Colombia, I was aware of ayahuasca as yahe, as it's referred to in kind of the Colombian Amazon. And so then I just had a growing curiosity in seeing what they were doing and working with it that way, not just like the direct personal experience as I had experienced before on the spirit walk, but like people who studied and trained to work with the plant medicine. And it made me very curious. At that point, then I had read, the DMT, the Spirit Molecule, and the Cosmic Serpent by Jeremy Narby, and just the increasing curiosity about ayahuasca. So then eventually I went, after I finished residency in 2007, I went down for my first experience there, and I had a really big experience, that started me on my journey.
Is that the point where your book starts?
My book starts, so the book, The Fellowship of the River, a medical doctor's exploration to traditional Amazonian plant medicine, starts and really in medical school. But the structure of the book, there's an introduction, and then there's the first ayahuasca experience, and then it goes back. Like, how did I end up, in Peru drinking ayahuasca with the Amazonian healers? And so then I take it back to getting depressed in medical school, and what was that like for me? And then going to peyote, and then it turns into catching back up with the trail of the ayahuasca, journey.
Wow. Yeah. So the books, I've had a chance to read some excerpts of it, and I love your perspective on it. And maybe also, for a little background, talk about your medical degree and your practice, and how that dovetails into your current work now, which I really want to talk to you about, but I want to fill in this blank here with
Sure.
everything.
Right. Yeah, I am a family medicine doctor. So I went to medical school, and then I ended up ultimately completing my family medicine training at UCLA. And then after that, I was working as a doctor, a family medicine doctor, in kind of primary care and urgent care settings. And then I spent a couple years doing research at UCSD, UC San Diego, in Paul Mills' lab, Tiffany's partner. And so I was at the Paul Mills lab, where Shamini also trained. She got her PhD under Paul Mills. So I knew people that knew Paul. And I was being encouraged to seek a career in academia because of my interest. I had a mentor, and there was a research pathway. I just needed to find a principal investigator. And so Paul ended up being somebody that came into my life as a research mentor, but also as a kind of a spiritual mentor. And now he's the director of Deepak Chopra's research, so it's he's a very silent, but just like silence is thunder. Paul's role, you see it as it's entering your world, in the sense that, and I don't know, he doesn't do a lot of podcasts, I don't think, and maybe he would, But, you know, you've got Chamonix. He kind of opened the door for this biofield research to occur at UCSD. And then he let me come in. I was actually there to do low intensity light therapy research, which is kind of related to the biofield work, which was this kind of very low intensity red and infrared light that was demonstrating, and still continues to demonstrate benefit. And you see it at these chiropractors' offices and a few podiatrists, and it's still going. And it's just an interesting physiology of the responsiveness of tissue to light. And in this case, it was for diabetic wound healing. And so Paul's lab, where they, just like for Chamonix, they study a lot of inflammation because it's kind of a psychoneural immunology lab. So they're tracking inflammatory response to, you know, behavioral interventions, whether it's exercise. You know, previously his work was based on meditation. So the way meditation was affecting the way white blood cells, you know, were responding to hormones and things like that. So that's the kind of lab that it was. So I spent a couple years there. So my focus was on the light therapy and the wounds, but I participated in their other studies as a doctor. I would do the physicals for their other research. And so I would learn about the other research that they were doing, which was focused on a number of things, you know, exercise, depression, immune function, cardiovascular stuff. So I got exposed to psychoneuroimmunology, and then what's now the psych field of like psychoneuroendocrine immunology. Spent a couple of years at that lab, did postdoctoral research, and, you know, published a few papers on light therapy and initiated our study. But at that time, I started getting very involved. I started going back down to Peru more often. And Paul was supported, like, you know, I had time to go and do that. And we did a conference together down there where he presented some psychoneuroimmunologic principles, and, you know, to an Amazonian shaman who found it very interesting and felt like this is what the system or the body that they were working on.
Wow. And you found that shaman was receptive to that kind of information.
He was. I mean, there's a lot of very, you know, just like in any population, you know, he's a very kind of nerdy minded guy, you know. He could really follow that kind of information. He's a very intellectually curious person. And so he was the one that really kind of said, this is it right here. Like, that's the system we're working on, which made sense, you know, but that's kind of been like, that kind of strengthened my feeling about it and made me more curious to explore that connection between, you know, what is the field of mind-body research that I was getting exposed to at Paul's lab, you know, which has become this really, you know, interesting, like, interdisciplinary field that, you know, sparks the interest of somebody like Chamonix and biofield work, and then somebody like Deepak Chopra, you know, where they want to be able to start tracking the impact of something like a biofield, you know, subtle energy, emotional intervention, lifestyle intervention, altered state of consciousness, as in meditation, the way that would alter the physiology of the body. So this system of the body, the psychoneuroimmunologic system, has been that network that kind of functions in concert with itself, connecting, you know, as I mentioned, the limbic system, you know, the emotional processing center of the brain, which is a big kind of integrator of sensory experience, integrating our experience from the outside world with our internal experience, sensorily. You know, how do we feel inside, and how does it feel? What does it look like out there? And the way that's connected to our autonomic nervous system, that's controlling all these automatic functions like breathing and heart rate and digestion, you know, and sweating, and in fact, the expression of our emotions, you know, someone's blushing, they're crying, they're laughing, etc. And then the way that that's directly wired into certain elements of the immune system. Like I was telling you, how Paul's studying the way white blood cells are responding differently to hormones in response to meditation. And or, you know, things like someone's faith, you know, when comparing different people, Alzheimer caregivers that burn out, and why do some people taking care of somebody with Alzheimer's they seem to have the resource to deal with it, while someone else is burned out and is very stressed out. And you can actually tell physiologically that they're showing signs of like stress overload, and the other person doesn't. You know, if you check their blood for inflammatory markers or track their blood pressure, et cetera, and seeing that, wow, it's kind of related to their belief system. And then that similarly, as I've kind of mentioned, is that's connected to their hormonal function, you know, the endocrine function and the way the cortisol levels and certain, you know, let's say like epinephrine or adrenaline, you know, and norepinephrine and noradrenaline and fight or flight responses and that kind of stuff that people can kind of relate to, the way that's altered. And so that, you know, because I had been exposed to that, and then I saw that that was kind of the system that was responding to this type of treatment, this Amazonian plant medicine treatment that I was a part of, you know, for years down there in Peru with ayahuasca and, you know, the shamanism and also the plants and then this larger context of doing these restrictive diets, you know, in a natural setting. But I saw that that was kind of the system that was responding, you know, and that system has also been kind of the big focus of people like, you know, Gabor Mate's work, you know, when the body says no, and the stress physiology, stress biology. And now we're hearing another perspective on that same system from Peter Levine, you know, and the trauma dynamics and somatic experience therapy of like, they're just talking about this discharge of trauma energy, the way it is embodied, the way it affects the physiology, the way you can witness that in animals, and then, you know, in parallel in human beings. And how do you release trauma? And Peter Levine, you know, he starts out his book talking about, hey, this is what shamans do. This is what shamans have been talking about. That's how the Waking the Tiger starts out. He introduces the concept around that. He's just saying, well, but you know what? It's not as mystical as they may make it sound. You know, he's trying to make the argument, you know, some of these cultures make it sound like only the shaman knows how to do this. He's like, well, let me demystify it for you. It's just part of your normal function and your response to trauma. And there's a lot of ways to release it. And then he provides, you know, his techniques to do that. So it's those fields, you know, and then you see something similar happen with breath work, where you really engage the breath and the autonomic function around the breath that is connected once again to these emotional centers in the brain, to the immune centers, to the endocrine centers. And so start voluntarily, you know, controlling that, engaging that system, and then seeing a lot of similar response, you know, this huge trauma release and kind of stuff. And so that's this whole idea. So then in the book, I try to make this argument of that we've identified the emotional body as it's been described, you know, in Chinese medicine or Ayurvedic medicine or other traditions, that there's this idea of an emotional body that the doctors and the medical scientists maybe have kind of shied away from that concept, I guess, because it's like, because it starts to touch on the subjective, you know, but meanwhile, they're collecting all this subjective data, which is apparently respectable, you know, doing anxiety questionnaires on people when you're testing an anti-anxiety medication and you want to prove that it's marketable. Well, you'd have to take people's word for it, I guess. Then it's okay to ask them how they feel, you know, or an antidepressant study. Like, for sure, they have depression scales that have been validated. And so that's a very subjective measure that is, you know, that is extremely influential in the world of, you know, psychopharmacology, extremely. And so this idea that then there's other elements of the subjective experience that no doubt relate to our health and that, you know, can be tracked. And so that's kind of what we start getting into, this emotional body and showing that, hey, look, you know, look at this person who's traumatized by taking care of somebody with Alzheimer's, you know, like this idea of like these different kinds of traumas that would overwhelm the system. Number one, a trauma that was so severe that the system just can't take it, you know, let's say like a severe sexual abuse, you know. Then you've got these other traumas of like where it's just repetitive and there's no relief, there's no come back to baseline. So you start, you know, wringing the system out, let's say like in an Alzheimer caregiver situation. Or, you know, I don't know, there's other little scenarios you can imagine of different frequencies or intensities of trauma that would overwhelm the system.
Mm-hmm.
So you see how that kind of emotional trauma would overwhelm the system, this emotional exhaustion of caring for a loved one who can't care for themselves. And then you see evidence in their psychoneural immunologic network or the psychoneural endocrine immunologic network where it's overwhelmed. And their, you know, their cortisol cycles start getting thrown off. You know, their blood pressure starts to climb up. Their wounds don't heal as fast as they used to. So this is a well-studied phenomenon now, and that's go ahead.
Well, I love that. That's amazing. I was going to ask you to define that. You did more than that in a very elegant way. So let's bookmark the PNEI system.
Right.
And talk to us about what Amazonian plant medicine is, more specifically the tradition that you have studied and participated in.
Yeah. So I've been involved in a Shipibo tradition. So then the Shipibos are a native people to the upper Amazon in Peru who are, you know, one of many, many tribes of the region of indigenous people. The Shipibo are a little bit unique in that particular region around Pucallpa, Iquitos, where they've maintained a lot of their culture, you know, most significantly their language, where a lot of the other tribes that we say, you know, they become mestizos, like all the way through the entire Latin America, right, where you have a significant amount of indigenous blood in the population, but, you know, mixed with European to varying degrees. But still, you might encounter somebody who perhaps they have no European blood, really, you know, to speak of if you were to study their DNA, but they speak Spanish. You know, their language has been erased, and with that, you know, a lot of knowledge in the culture. Whereas, you know, a Native American language alive does give access to, you know, some pre-Columbian concepts that maybe would not be as, you know, present. And so the Shipibo still maintain a lot of their culture, and there's still a lot of traditional Shipibo communities, you know, in the upper Amazon. And so they are also known for kind of a very dedicated plant medicine tradition, where they use, you know, it's the Amazon, so you have this huge variety of plants that can be used and are, you know, are used for traditional medicine, like as a, you know, herbal use, for even perhaps in some cases their pharmacologic properties. But then they have this, you know, shamanic, curanderismo, you know, spiritual tradition around the use of plants for spiritual healing. And so that would include the use of ayahuasca, which is, you know, regarded as a psychedelic, you know, plant medicine that is causes, you know, profoundly altered states of consciousness and visionary experiences. And so there's shamans, or that then, you know, they don't really like, I'm still using the term because for our purposes it's useful, but they're not crazy about the term shaman. That's become a thing now. The people are saying we have our own word for that. You know, the shamans are it's a Siberian term, you know, from the anthropologists. They started using their terms like medicine man, medicine woman, medicine person, or spiritual healer, you know, one that works with the spirits, altered states of consciousness, invites mysterious energies into the process. And so they, you know, they prefer in Spanish curandero, or they say onaya. I think it's onanya in Shipibo. It means a person of knowledge. It means someone who has a master who has trained with the plants.
Mm.
So they go through these, they're guided by the plants. So they have a whole system of education, traditional education, through these diets that you study plants. And they talk about it even now in videos, very, you know, like this was our higher education. If somebody wanted to pursue this at college age, then they would start doing it at that time, to start studying in a way to learn about mystical healing techniques through these plant diets. And that's still going on. And now they're training Westerners to do that. And I've been through that training. And so that's what it is. And so they, people come down to a center like ours, and, where I'm a consultant currently at Niue Rao, and they go through a process where they are put on this traditional diet, this restrictive diet that's considered to be very important and healing and cleansing and purifying and also spiritually significant. And then in that process, they connect to a plant for spiritual reasons, a master plant that may not have any like biochemical psychoactivity, but would be kind of like a homeopathic type of idea or something like that, that would connect them to an energy and guide them in their dreams and their thoughts. And then within the ayahuasca ceremony, it would influence them. So then they go to ayahuasca ceremony several times, in the week. And then they're sung to by the shamans to have this kind of spiritual healing, energetic healing, a biofield healing through sound, through music, through the song. And then that's the healing process that they go through. And then as I talk about in the book, I describe the healing of people with, I give the examples of kind of the classic examples that a lot of people are going to psychedelic medicine for. First is anxiety, depression. Then I talk about PTSD, addiction. Those are the big ones. But then I try to get into some of the psychosomatic cases that we see that maybe would be overlooked as we look at this connection between emotional trauma, the PNEI network, emotional biology, trauma physiology, and then the release of, whatever needs to be healed through a process like what I just described with the Amazonian plant medicine, and seeing people improve from migraine headaches, from this, what we call idiopathic chronic cough of unknown origin, Crohn's disease, inflammatory bowel disease, chronic pain, chronic back pain, chronic knee pain, a few other things that I described in the book. And so those, as a doctor, as a medical doctor, where I know those are the kind of problems that we're struggling with, where the person is basically deemed to have a chronic disease that's not going to get better, that they need to learn how to live with and manage with, pharmaceuticals. And then to find that, wow, these people are healing from these problems that we didn't think could be healed within the lifespan. And what is it about what we're doing that's allowing this to heal? And it's a lot about healing trauma. And it's a lot about taking this load, this emotional burden off of the system so that the PNAI network can start to go back to baseline, start functioning, So somebody that's overdone, like you said, just like the same Alzheimer caregiver case, got somebody who's just burnt out, and really they're talking about Alzheimer caregiver burnout. They've been studying it since I was there. That was 2007. They were studying it before then. I had friends of mine were studying that at UCSD years before. So this is a known thing, burnout, and it's a common knowledge, common sense concept. And just that we just don't have ways to address that, within the kind of insurance-based healthcare system, because it's like it doesn't get addressed in a short visit, once a week. Psychotherapy is an option where people do, respond, and many people do improve. It's been a very slow process for so many people that it's made it kind of cost prohibitive in a lot of, circumstances. So the idea that this could be accelerated, that kind of healing could be accelerated the way shamans and traditional healers have discussed for centuries and millennia. This is not a new thing, that people would go to war and come back and be deeply affected emotionally, by, there was a guy, Credo Mutwa, is a Zulu teacher from South Africa. It's like one of the big wise teachers. And he was talking about how he heard reading like medieval English about these guys, these knights coming home from battle, and then making love to their spouse, with their armor on, like straight from battle. And in their culture, it would be like, whoa, no, when somebody comes back from war, it's like it's a 1 week process of this and this and this and this before you would even consider bringing that energy, into the womb of your spouse. So this idea that, trauma, and I've been talking to people about this movie that's out, From Shock to Awe, is a really beautiful movie that is being released and through kind of some screenings across the country, FromShockToAwe.com, about healing PTSD, taking some really severely affected Afghan and Iraqi vets, American soldiers, 2 couples, following them for years when they're trying to do what they're doing, So this is a classic example, is Vietnam vet, In the book, I present a Vietnam vet. So he's a Vietnam vet. That means by the time he came to our thing in 2009, he's a good 40 years into his process. So this would be considered chronic PTSD. In other words, hey, sorry, you went to Vietnam. That's your whole life right there. And, him talking to my friend Russ is the guy that went through the healing, and him talking about going to group therapy sessions at the VA and seeing these young guys, these Iraq vets and Afghani vets, looking at him as an old man and just saying, oh my God, am I going to be coming to these meetings for the rest of my life? And then these guys are going, and then, they try the therapy, but maybe it just doesn't penetrate. Some of them get some help, but a lot of them don't. And then they're given all these medications, and in the movie, these guys show their medicine cabinets full of 80 different prescriptions over 4 years, and they feel terrible. And they're really frustrated. And then through marijuana, they get some kind of stability. And then through ayahuasca, these 2 individuals have a profound healing. And all of a sudden, they're not requiring all that stuff anymore. And so like, that's what we're talking about is just traditional healing techniques that, what are they doing? Well, as I talk about in the book, they're addressing the emotional and spiritual dimensions of illness. And that's what's missing in the paradigm. And that's why people have to look outside of the paradigm. Because within a purely mental perspective, although the mental is very in quotes, because it extends into all these subjective realms that are just overlooked by the know-it-alls that, say, oh no, well, that's a mental health problem. Whatever that is, it is a complete mystery, what's going on inside our minds. But it's not considered a mystical discussion. And then the physical, which is more obvious, than materially oriented, but once again, apparently made out of quantum physical particles.
Yeah. Well, one of the things this is really the first time we spoke in depth about traditional plant medicine in any context. And one thing in my small experience that was profound realization, witnessing everything that was going on, was how vast this system is. And I think that is important to get out, because a lot of people that are hearing about ayahuasca are not hearing about it inside the Amazon, right? They're hearing it from the outside, and it is usually, I'm hearing it a lot in sort of the psychedelic research context and what is going on here, and really what's happened, more research oriented stuff, not necessarily therapeutic. And it struck me that this is one concoction of which there are thousands of other plants involved in the healing process. And it really, one of the way that it was acting on me was opening a doorway to access and to receive from all these other things. So then that kind of reshaped my understanding of what the word spiritual actually means. That there's a pantheon, that the spirit world is something that we're talking about, not necessarily like a single entity.
That's right. So, and it's a mysterious thing, and so then people they want everything to be so well defined, you know, for them to like, oh, I can't talk about that because that's not well defined, you know. But then they go home to their girlfriend and argue about some silly thing and that they can't wrap their head around, and they got to work it out, you know. It's like, yeah, it's not well defined. Like many things that you will experience in this life are not well defined. And even those that you think are well defined is like, you know, it's based on a lot of assumptions that we're working with that may change. And so, you know, traditional Amazonian plant medicine, that's how I like to talk about it. You know, my family's from Colombia, to introduce to the world in a way, in a way that I haven't really like seen, that this is like an entire school, vast, like, you know, just like traditional Chinese medicine, which actually TCM, or, you know, they used to call Oriental medicine because, yeah, it involves Japanese stuff and Korean stuff and Chinese stuff. And then you know, that's not even including like Southeast Asian tropical plant medicine, which must be like a very vast system. So perhaps less institutionalized, you know, so maybe not as much, not as strong of a university presence. And so that academic kind of consideration that maybe we would, you know, even Western herbalism struggles to get into, you know, Western academic, like, whatever, respect, you know, European herbal medicine. So you have that issue of just herbal medicine by and large being kind of disregarded currently. And there's reasons, you know, there's a lot of room outside of some institutionalized system, although there's plenty of room for corruption within such a system, and we're all well aware of that. But there's a lot of room for what they would call like charlatanism, you know, just the snake oil and somebody just telling you, hey, this is good, and trying to get you to go for it. And we see that a lot in the ayahuasca tourism. You know, we see a lot of people getting preyed upon, naive people getting preyed upon by people who would, you know, be willing to take advantage of them, you know, usually for economic reasons or for some other power play. And then we see, you know, sexual abuse happening, where there are a lot of pitfalls of what's going on right now that are taking away from the reality that despite those kind of corrupt practices and those things that are very risky for people to get involved in, and people need to be warned about and need to be very careful about, at the same time, there is a core tradition, you know, where the good people, the medicine people of those cultures and societies were actually trying to help their loved ones and their communities. And so they have been working with these plants from Brazil all the way up and down the Amazon, you know, a huge area, into Colombia and Venezuela and Peru and Bolivia and Ecuador, you know, for example, as far as the Amazonian region. So that's massive. And so then you have a pre-Columbian society that, you know, we have very little idea about. 1491 is a book that tries to explore it. You know, Lost City of Z tries to explore, like, there's reports from Orellanos, the first Spaniard to go down the Amazon, of, like, you know, huge populations up and down, and all this evidence of this, like, you know, transformed soils along the region. Reports of, like, maybe in that 1491, they said, you know, there's parts of the Amazon along the river where maybe 80% of the plants were planted. You know, this idea of, like, how big was that society, that civilization, how much interconnection and communication did they have? The Shipibos regularly talk about, you know, interaction with the Incans, the Inca Empire, and, you know, which has their advanced kind of culture and civilization. And, you know, ayahuasca itself is a Quechua word from the Incan language. And so there's a lot of crosstalk. And so this idea that there was a lot of knowledge being exchanged, and there's a lot of wisdom and experience being exchanged around the use of these plant medicines. So that's traditional Amazonian plant medicine that now, you know, has been dwindled down to these pockets, but still you have the use of the, you know, of the country person who lives, you know, near the forest and maybe doesn't speak the language anymore, but still inherited, like, a lot of knowledge of local plant use. And so that whole system exists, and that's traditional Amazonian plant medicine. Within that, there's a herbal tradition, you know, just pure herbal medicine, plant medicine for physical illness, you know, let's say for an infection, for, whatever it is, urinary tract infection or a cough or something like that, a fever, illness. So plant medicine is just focused on medical illness. Then there's the shamanic tradition, where there would be a specialist who would focus on herbalism, or a specialist who had a particular interest in shamanic, spiritual type curiosity. There. Then you have the body workers. You have people who focus on physical therapies and, bone setting and massage and all that kind of stuff. And even energy healing in that kind of realm and biofield stuff. And then you have midwifery, women all of around feminine health and birth. And so there's just that, we know that still exists in the region, and it's not taught in the university. It's taught from master to apprentice, like most trades on the planet Earth. I would say like martial arts is maybe something that we're very familiar with here, where it's a very living, thriving tradition that does have to demonstrate its utility. I mean, they have the mixed martial arts now where they have to prove, what did you learn? Is it enough to beat that guy? It's not just talk. And so in the same way, this medicine is tried in on a community. And if you are just blah, 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 the community is going to figure it out, and if you were able to really help some people, then they're going to realize that. So the traditional healer is not legitimized by paperwork. The traditional healer is legitimized by a community that can vouch for their capacity and their skill set. And so those are the kind of thing. And, of course, that still exists, in the trades. If you have somebody that's doing landscaping at your house, or you have somebody that's doing, building, your plumber, whatever, these are things that in normal human society, they work themselves out. And of course, life and death is an issue. So there's a more strict policies, at least in our society, around that, and trying to protect against charlatanism and things like that. But there's, in that scientific kind of control of like, okay, we're going to make sure you got to prove it. You've got to prove everything you're saying. If we don't know the mechanism of how it works, it's out, doesn't fly, So then you have this focus on the biochemical function and then pharmaceutical activity and mechanisms, and then the double-blind, studies. So why, they're very powerful. We've learned a lot that way. And the problem is we're suffering with these epidemics of addiction, depression, anxiety, PTSD, and this psychosomatic stuff, that no matter how much money they're pouring into the research, it's not getting better. It's getting worse. Until now, we see these breaks because people are like, their trauma is not getting healed. And that's the reason I brought up that movie, is because at the end of the movie, one of the vets is like, my God, like I finally realized healing. What is healing? Like healing is a concept that we've just lost. And because of that, our society has become a repository of trauma. And that's what we see, And once this guy starts going through this healing, and this is just this other part of the system, okay, mind, body, that I was talking about, and I was like, oh, this emotional body. But then all these other traditions are teaching us, well, the emotional body is kind of paired to the energy body. The chakra system, or the meridian system, or all these other mystical things that people are connected to. And so when you have somebody so covered in trauma, and this came up at the SAND conference, I can't remember his name, the guy who wrote the Diamond series, the spiritual teacher, and he talked about how he was talking to Peter Levine, and he was saying, he was reviewing like these different spiritual teachers, and how they would say, it's so hard to find a good student. And he said, but you know what? It probably was trauma. Because you see it happen all the time, and you see it happen to these guys in the movie. Once you start healing this trauma, all of a sudden this mystical access opens. Once the emotional body's functioning is improved, then it is the one that has the sensitivity through our feeling to sense, that which is very subtle.
Let's dig into this connection between the we'll call it something like the physical construct of the emotional body, the
Yeah.
PNEI network,
Right.
and the more subtle aspects of emotion. Can you, as far as you see it,
I think
clarify that for us?
well, the first clarification, to the living human beings, for which I share this society with, is like it's as real as joy, and it's as real as heartache. So we could just establish that. Like if we're not ready to discuss joy and we're not ready to discuss heartache, it's like, well, it's kind of a boring conversation. So we can just leave everybody who doesn't want to touch on those topics, they can stay out of it. When they're ready to address this because of something they've been through in their life, we welcome the discussion. But if they don't want to hear about these subtle aspects of our experience, which are just, so obvious and so real and so intimate and so influential on the experience of our lives, with our families, with our loved ones, which is what so many people, it seems, from what we hear at the time of their death, like that is their preoccupation, is how they left their relationships. So first is, just to admit that our subjective experience of emotion is very influential in our life, and we don't understand all the mechanisms behind it. That doesn't mean that we should deny that we feel these things. So if we deny the subjective experience, we're basically cutting it in half. We're not, it's a lie. It's a blatant lie. And I'm not trying to be aggressive. It's just, it is, it's just like, we just have to be honest, and in out of compassion, for everyone. Like, we just want to let them know, it's like, yeah, if we don't talk about that, then we're kind of not talking about the full thing. And in anyone, if in your personal relationships that you go through your life, if you run into people who are not willing to acknowledge that element of yourself, then it's really disappointing, quite often, And so we do have feelings, we do have feelings. And so how far do those feelings go? How far into feeling, are we willing to delve and discuss, when people can obviously sense the feeling in the room, or they get a bad feeling from this coworker at work that they don't like it, this is negative for their environment. They wish they weren't around that person or something like that, or somebody else is very inspiring to them and they get a lot of energy from being around that person, or they're in sports, and everybody's trying to hold on to a positive thought and a positive prayer, for their team, and they don't want anyone to disrupt that, to jinx, the situation, and they might get very upset, if somebody were to like play around with that. Or in music, how it's so, I think, in our society universally accepted that, they're gonna play music in such a way that everyone there is going to be ideally in the same exact like groove and feeling and just join, in that. And so then we see it in religious practice, that it is accepted that for certain people and their particular religious practice, that a lot of people get into some really inspired feelings, and they go to grieve, and they go to release and all kinds, to forgive, all those kind of things. So I'm saying that all those things I just talked about, I would say that they have some kind of connection to this emotional body, the psychoneuroendocrinology network we just discussed. There is probably measurable evidence in that system for all these things that we just discussed, So that would be like a bridge for us to now talk about how spiritual health manifests in emotional well-being. And so we don't need to argue about who knows more about what you talked about before, like this pantheon, this realm of spirits, the vast, mystery upon mystery upon mystery of the spiritual world, you know, they spend all their time, or a lot of people spend their time, who knows more? I know this, I know that, you know, oh, this means this means that. And that's what they're like, the focus is on that kind of very ego oriented discussion. When in fact, like I was mentioning, you know, when I went to peyote, it was like for healing, for medicine. And like Maria Sabina, the mushroom Mazatec shaman healer that exposed all these Americans to the mushrooms, you know, and they started coming to her and say, oh, but, you know, teach us about God. We want to know about consciousness. You know, we want to expand our consciousness. And she said to them, we don't do it for that. You know, that's not what this is for. This is for healing. And like, as you heal your soul and spirit, then the answers to those questions will reveal themselves, you know, through your own connection to spirit. And so I'm kind of digress there, but what I was trying to say is that it's about health and well-being. And so emotional health then becomes like a window and a bridge for us to talk about a universal spirituality. Now I can say, look, your spiritual practice, you know, for example, a silly example, Rickert, we had all these yoga instructors, you know, coming to drink ayahuasca, of course, naturally, you know, the West Coast yoga movement. It's like you check the box, you got to drink ayahuasca, you got to do ayahuasca. A lot of people were coming and they wanted a discount, you know, because they were, they're yoga instructors. So they could teach a few classes and they get a discount. But then we found, and then Ricardo, as a Shipibo shaman, and his experience of meeting these people, he was very suspicious of yoga. He's like, this is a bad thing because there's a witchcraft to this. He's like, I don't want anyone doing these postures because there's some witchcraft to this, because it's like these people are so ego bound. It's like this is an ego like strengthening thing somehow, you know. And I'm just saying as an example of like pointing out like the pitfall of maybe some particular flavor of some belief system, you know, to say actually, oh, maybe this is closing your mind, you know. Let's look out for that. Let's, you know, well, we could try to assess their endocrine immunologic health, you know, try to see like, you know, what's going on with their default mode network, you know, this neuroscientific network that's being shown to be, you know, are they being too stubborn and closed-minded? You know, what's going on with their heart, you know, and we could do heart rate variability. What's going on with inflammation in their blood? You know, this person's telling this other person, hey, you know, if you're not going to do this or this, you're going to go straight to hell and blah, blah, blah. And you're going to go straight to hell. And now you're a holy person, you know, amen. And then you see these people struggling with anxiety and depression and all these issues, you know. And so it's like, it's bringing the conversation to a universal discussion around health.
Tell us about your current work or your current exploration into epigenetics and what you're up to in that regard.
So just briefly, like, and in trying to explore what was it that we were helping with these people with when you're helping them unload these energies, you know, unload this trauma, and where does this trauma pile up and accumulate in the body at the biochemical level? And there's this evidence that epigenetics is this part where it's not the DNA, but the coding, the covering of the DNA. As Bruce Lipton says, it's not the blueprint, the DNA blueprint, but the contractor that reads the blueprint. That one that responds to the environment and is able to use the same code to do different things. You know, the same DNA code is what makes a red blood cell and what makes a nerve cell. And the difference between the two is epigenetic programming. So then there's some positive epigenetic programming, and then there's maladaptive programming. Response to stress, you know, overwhelmed stress, this burnout that we were talking about, that somehow that could lead to this maladaptive programming in the epigenetics. And there's reason to believe that there's maladaptive programming related to trauma that is contributing to anxiety and depression and PTSD and things like that we've been talking about, and even migraine headaches and Crohn's disease and everything we've talked about. So I build that case in the book. to say, hey, look at this. Wow, all this emotional burden is linked to this epigenetic stuff. And when you see somebody heal from physical symptoms, when you see this Vietnam vet go from, really bad blood pressure problems and diabetes and all that stuff starts getting better, when the chronic pain goes away, when the Crohn's disease, diarrhea goes away, and the migraine headaches go away, and something changed in their physical body. And what was that thing that changed across this portal that we've been talking about, from this energetic approach, subjective, mystical approach into their emotional being that led to a physical change? And they say, well, they show that, definitely we know that love or maltreatment or lack of love in childhood leads to epigenetic changes. We know that meditation and altered states of consciousness can lead to epigenetic changes. We know that psychotherapy can lead to epigenetic changes. So we'd already have proof of like these very subjective, very immaterial influences that lead to this physiologic change in the body, this epigenetics. And so with PTSD, there's been a lot of research around PTSD and epigenetic stuff and seeing what's happening, because it seems like these people, they get into such a physical altered state, with super, high stress response, even high blood pressure and immune inflammatory problems, cortisol problems, emotional body problems throughout the network. And then they go through a significant healing and that stuff clears up. And the most significant healing that we have kind of on record that has been studied around PTSD currently is the MDMA assisted psychotherapy. So that is the trial being run by MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association of Psychedelic Studies, where they started using MDMA, the psychedelic medicine, within a therapeutic context, within the assisted psychotherapy context, where they're getting therapy to prepare, assisted psychotherapy in an MDMA session, maybe 2 or 3 times, that's it, with therapy in between each session and therapy to wrap it up. And over a period of, I don't know if it's 8 or 12 weeks or something like that, they've shown anywhere from, it's in the 76% response to people who had treatment-resistant PTSD. So it's like Russ, Vietnam vet, he's tried a lot of things. It's been 40 years, nothing's worked. All these people are years and years into PTSD. They've tried a lot of therapies. Now they do this, and all of a sudden, huge shift. They don't have symptoms anymore. Some of them don't qualify for PTSD anymore. And so they've actually been through a healing. And then as they study them for years, 1 year, 2 year, 3 year, they're getting more and more data. It lasts. Maybe you see a little drop. Maybe it drops to 60-something percent. But they were at 0, progress previously. So these people, and they're healing, they're doing this. So now they're expanding that trial because of the incredible response rate to the trial. The FDA is giving them this breakthrough therapy protocol. So now they're going to expanded access and doing it at many more centers to collect much more data on many more people over the next 2 years. And if it works out well, then it's going to be legal to prescribe it through an FDA process. In these 2 years, as they expand the trial, we're going to start collecting saliva. We've already started. Modern Spirit, our nonprofit, is collecting saliva to look for epigenetic changes, before, during, after, sometime after, to look for changes in this epigenetic regions to show this physiology, the biochemistry of this deep emotional healing that these people are going through, and that it's changing their health and their body in a way that the materialists, will respond to, and it'll open this frontier.
And so are you testing only in regard to MDMA?
We are currently, yeah.
Okay, and what are you specifically testing for?
So we are testing only the MAPS. We started the initial idea, because the whole idea came to me through ayahuasca and through my experience with people, was to do it on the ayahuasca, retreats. The thing is, to do that, we started exploring that. And so it was about the saliva samples, and we brought a group down. We brought some people down from Yale, some people down from Pittsburgh, to kind of evaluate the idea and go through the process. And it was, getting the samples, refrigerating the samples, storing the samples, and having them shipped back to the US. Currently, the study is based at University of Southern California, USC, under Dr. Rael Khan. He's an MD, PhD, and a good friend of mine. So he's the investigator. And as we kind of examined that, and then we got kind of closer to the MAPS people, and the MAPS people just have this so many more, like, to collect in Peru, for example, at our center, or a Temple of the Way of Light, who was interested in participating, and getting together the right number of people, or Ayahuasca Foundation, the right number of, like, depression cases, or the right number of anxiety cases to be able to publish something. Better to have a diagnosis-focused study where they're getting all this corroborating data, on these anxiety scales and the depression scales, and showing, we have all this other data to compare what we collect from the saliva and the epigenetics to that, to really be able to make a statement. So in the future, if we're able to establish something, then we could apply this to ayahuasca, to biofield therapies, to, meditation interventions, to all kinds of spiritual practice. So we're testing saliva, and then that's going to be looking at certain regions of kind of epigenetics around certain regions of the DNA. So for example, like something like the cortisol receptor. So cortisol is a hormone that's a stress hormone that, its behavior is known to change in these chronically stressed situations like Alzheimer's caregiver burnout, or PTSD. And you see, different variations in the way it's expressed or not expressed, the way it's turned on, the way it's turned off, and you see that there's this epigenetic change that happens. So that's an area that's already been looked at in a number of other, like, PTSD type of studies to show, like, oh, look, this is where the change happened, this is where the intervention helped. So there's other regions, around certain inflammatory markers, and we're exploring that right now. So right now, Modern Spirit has enough money to start the study, which is very simple. It's just sending out saliva kits to all the MAP centers, around all over the place. And then we are raising $200,000, which we're asking the world to help us. modernspirit.org describes the study a little more in depth and has the process of how you can donate. As we collect that money, then we're going to have the money to do the lab analysis, which is the expensive part of such a study. And again, so that's, why don't you just study this? Why don't you study that? Because it costs a lot of money. The reason a lot of epigenetics research is not happening is because it's very expensive at this stage. And so we see with Ancestry.com, we see DNA research, really come down to $100 saliva kit. Like before that was the Human Genome Project. And when I was in college, it was this, whatever massive supercomputer process. And now it's $100 kit you email in, and, I don't know how great it is, how great the results are, but they exist. And so, epigenetics, as we learn more and more about how to refine the analysis, but right now we're exploring, what these different people's lab approaches to these regions are. And we have a top team at USC, and with our research advisory team includes Yale psychiatrist, Ben Kelmendi, and another MD, PhD psychiatrist, David Rabin, and then a few other people. Paul Mills is on our educational advisory board. Shaman is on our educational advisory board. And we have a few other people, including Rachel Harris and who I don't know if you've interviewed her, and then my friend Stacy Gomes, who's one of the deans of the Chinese Medical School in San Diego. So those are the people guiding this project, So we have some top minds that have come together because they see that this is really something. And we believe, and MAPS is now who, they weren't so worried about, they didn't want blood tests and Rick Doblin, and, they just want to get it done and move things forward. But now they see this is pretty easy. We could do this, and we could open up this whole world of emotional biology a little wider.
Wow. Well, thank you, Dr. Zhou, for your time.
Yeah.
And,
thank you very much.
And so I'm assuming, just like myself, everybody who wants to get your book can do that on Amazon. Pretty straightforward. Fellowship
Correct.
of the River.
Audio and Kindle.
Okay, great. It's on audio. Great.
Yeah.
And modernspirit.org, if you would like to help out with the epigenetics research. Wow, good luck with everything.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me. Thank you for your time. Sorry to just talk and talk and talk, but I hope it was kind of what, it was the information I wanted to get out there.